第23届印顺导师思想之理论与实践国际学术会议佛教与当代动物伦理新书发表，现在开始。
The book launch of the 23rd International Conference on the Theory and Practice of the Teachings of Dharma Master Yingshun will now begin.
那因为时间有限，所以我们这一场只进行新书发表的内容，讨论的时间我们就放到今天下午一并讨论。那我们很荣幸的邀请到国立台湾师范大学历史学系主任吴友能教授担任本场次的主持人，欢迎吴教授。
We now invite Professor Wu Younen, currently as the chair of Department of History, National Taiwan Normal University, to be the moderator for this session.
同时，我们也再一次欢迎本场次的新书发表人，普林斯顿大学荣誉退休生物伦理学教授 Professor Peter Snger.
And we welcome Professor Peter Snger, Emeritus Professor of Bioethics, Princeton University. He is the speaker for this session.
Thank you very much. Once again, it's a great pleasure to be here and to be able to launch a traditional Chinese edition of Animal Liberation Now. So what I want to do now is to present some of the ideas that are from the old edition and also from the new one. So here you see the cover of the 1975 edition, almost exactly 50 years ago, because it was published in September. This is the United States edition, the first edition you're seeing. And on the other side of the screen, you see the edition that is just been published now in Taiwan. Oops. So let's look at the situation in 1975 when the first edition of Animal Liberation was published. The animal movement faced many challenges at that time. So the first challenge really was to get people to take I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry.
因为天下没有白吃的午餐呢，我等一下我怕我没有主持，昭威法师就给我收午餐费啊。所以我就耽误大家几分钟哈。Now, okay, let me give my welcome speech. And the Honorable Professor Peter Snger, Venerable Master Zhao Hui, distinguished colleagues, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen. Now, good morning, everyone. Well, it's a real honor and a great joy to welcome you to this special occasion, the launch of the Chinese translation of Professor Peter Snger's renowned work, Animal Liberation Now, the definitive classic renewal. Today is not just it's not about celebrating a book. It's about reflecting on our conscience, our compassion, and most importantly, the urging for action. Right? Almost 50 years ago, as Professor Peter Snger just mentioned, his work, Animal Liberation, changed the way people all over the world thought about animal and justice. With clarity and courage, he showed us that suffering of animals cannot be ignored if we want to call ourselves truly moral beings. That message has become more relevant with time when we heard about the news of suffering of human beings and non-human beings as well. This new Chinese edition brings those ideas into today's world. It reminds us of progress, law in Europe and United States, but also tough realities, the threats of factory farming, the environmental cost of misconsumption, and the threat of new pandemic. Still, this is not a book of despair. It is a book of hope. It is a book of love. It points us towards products, practical solution, plant-based diets, cruelty-free products, and sustainable living. It reminds us that philosophy isn't about only theory. It must move us to action now. This is what holding this launch here at玄奘University so meaningful. The university stands for compassion, wisdom, and social responsibility, social engagement, as Master Jiawei has pointed out. And we are deeply honored by the presence of Venerable Jiawei, whose scholarship and activism show us how moral vision, religious compassion can be turned into real change. She brings about a lot of change in Taiwan and around the world, and that in Buddhism as well. Let's give a applause to Master Jiawei. This event also echoes the humanistic spirit of Master Inshun, who taught that Buddhism must face the suffering of the world directly. The Chinese translation of this book, celebrated here in Taiwan, reflects the Mahayana Buddhist ideal of combining wisdom and compassion to see suffering clearly and to act with courage to release it. Professor Snger, your work has shown us that animal liberation and human liberation are deeply intertwined and connected. Today's launch is not just a literary celebration. It's a call to conscience, a call to action for all of us. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Peter Snger. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ng, for that ringing endorsement, and especially for adding the call to action that you mentioned. I'm very glad that we didn't miss that, and I apologize for my confusion at the beginning. So, as I was saying, what are the challenges that we faced in 1975, and what are the challenges that we face today? So, if we go back to 1975, there was opposition to cruelty as such to animals. That was generally condemned, certainly in the countries that I'm most familiar with, like Australia, the United Kingdom, and generally European nations, as well as the United States. But it was still generally accepted that the interests of humans always override the interests of animals. And that was and remains a serious problem. Animal welfare at the time was seen as a rather conservative cause. Progressives tended to see it as a distraction from the more important issues, which they regarded as issues about human beings. And finally, the idea that animals would have rights or that they could be given equal consideration of their interests was met with ridicule at the time. It was simply not taken seriously. So that was an important challenge to overcome. And to attempt to overcome it, I drew on the concept of speciesism, which is a bias against other beings simply because of their species and is analogous to racism and sexism. I want to say I did not invent the term speciesism. It was invented by Richard Ryder, who is somebody who I knew in Oxford when I was a graduate student and when I started thinking about these ideas. But I used it in animal liberation, and I think it became widely used after the publication of Animal Liberation. The second challenge in 1975, and again still to some extent today, is making people aware of how the animals they eat are raised and treated in factory farms. This is something that I did not know about myself until about 1970, when through a chance acquaintance with a vegetarian, I learnt that the animals I was eating had been raised, in the case of chickens, like this. Maybe 10 or 20,000 birds crowded into a single shed with no thought given to the well-being of the individual chickens. They were simply a commodity. So what the animal movement needed to do was to try to enlighten people about this, to show them photos and videos of how the animals they were consuming were treated. Even the idea of being vegetarian or vegan was seen as very peculiar in the 1970s. Again, I'm speaking about Western countries particularly here. Vegetarians were generally seen as cranks, if you like, people with rather strange ideas. And there were very few vegetarian or vegan products available in supermarkets and restaurants. Even the term vegan was not really understood at that time. And then, again, particularly in countries that had either a Jewish or Christian background, there was the problem of this verse of the book of Genesis, in which it said that God grants man dominion over all of the animals, and only man is made in the likeness of God. The animals are not. So that also was a challenge, because many people were influenced by this idea to think that we can dominate animals, that we can do as we wish with them. Fortunately, this is something that much more recently the Roman Catholic Church has come to reconsider. And we should thank Pope Francis for having stated very clearly in a papal encyclical, Laudato Si, which is the highest, most important kind of document that a pope can issue. He has said that, acknowledged that Christians sometimes incorrectly interpreted the scriptures, and he says nowadays we must forcefully reject the notion that our being created in God's image and given dominion over the earth justifies absolute domination over other creatures. So that is a significant step forward, at least for Christians and particularly for Roman Catholics, in how we think about animals. Let me talk a little bit now about some of the new challenges that we face and the continuing challenges that we must also deal with as we move onwards for the next 50 years of our concern advocating for a better world for animals. Whoops. So one problem is that we actually have more animals in factory farms now than we did in 1975, despite all the work that has gone into it and the growth of the animal movement in many countries. Let's just look at why we should focus, I believe, on the treatment of the animals we eat. We're going to hear in this conference about the treatment of laboratory animals, and that's a very important topic because that is quite a large number of animals when we think about it. Although we don't have really accurate estimates, something like 200 million vertebrate animals alone are killed for the purposes of research, in laboratory research. And that's a big number. But we need to compare it with the number of animals raised for food. This is a figure from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization for land-based vertebrate animals, and an estimate from a website called Fish Count for the number of fish raised in intensive aquaculture. It's approximately 200 billion. So, as I said, laboratory animal research is an important topic, but for every animal killed in laboratory research, 1,000 animals are raised and killed for food, for human food. And that is not including wild-caught fish. I'm talking only here of animals who we bring into existence and where we dominate every aspect of their life to produce them for food. Why has this number grown so much in the 50 years? Well, a large part of the answer to that question comes from this part of the world, from East Asia, and particularly the fact that East Asia is more prosperous than it was, China most particularly, and because these countries are more prosperous, people are buying more meat and other animal products, and that's been a big factor in the increase in the number of animals in factory farms, and I'll show you a bit more about that in a moment. So let's look, though, on the positive side, as Professor Ng said in his introduction, there is hope and there has been progress in 50 years, despite the depressing growth in the number of animals in factory farms. For example, one of the methods of producing meat that I wrote about in Animal Liberation, in the first edition, was keeping very young calves in individual stalls, like you see here, in order to produce veal, in order to produce very soft and pale meat from young calves, which fetched a high price. And to do that, the calves were taken from their mothers at a very early age and put in these narrow stalls where they lived for the rest of their lives, never coming out of those stalls until they were taken to slaughter. And in those stalls, they could not even turn around. The stalls were too narrow. The idea was to confine them so they do not develop muscles and the flesh remains pale and soft. And they were fed on a milk replacement product that was deliberately kept low in iron so that the flesh would be pale in colour and not the same red colour as beef. Well, that is no longer permitted in the European Union and in some other jurisdictions elsewhere. So we have made progress with that. Also, in the same countries where we have made progress with veal calves, that is the European Union, the United Kingdom, and to some extent, but not completely in the United States, this method of keeping the mother pigs in factory farms is no longer permitted. These are the female, the mothers, the sows, who are pregnant. Their role in the industry is simply to produce more piglets, and then the piglets are taken away from them to be fattened and used for food, and the mother is made pregnant again, and she goes through this cycle several times. And whenever she's pregnant, she's kept like this in these stalls, which again, as you see, are too narrow for her to turn around. She can only stand up or lie down all day. And you can also see that there is no straw or any kind of comfortable bedding. The sows are just lying on metal slats. And that again is for economic reasons. It's cheaper. It's cheaper not to have to provide straw, which you would have to remove and get new straw now and again because it would become covered in manure and urine. So all you do with these metal slats is you hose them down and the manure has gone. So everything is done for the sake of producing a cheaper product. Nothing is done to enhance the welfare of the animals. And I was mentioning China before. Here you see this practice with the sow stalls in a pig production unit in China. You can see how enormous this is. The number of sows just vanishes into the distance. And many of these pig factories, because that's what they are, factories for producing pigs, are now multi-story. There's a 26-story pig factory in China, and more are being built, and some other countries in Asia are planning or considering building them as well, in Hong Kong and also in South Korea. These are the pigs who are actually sent to market, not these sows, also kept in very crowded, confined conditions, and essentially nothing for them to do all day except eat and just move a little bit in their stalls. Egg-laying hens. Again, there has been some progress here in the same countries, the European Union, the United Kingdom, in California. This method of keeping hens in cages has been prohibited because it has been shown to be cruel. Veterinarians and other scientists agree that this is a cruel way to keep hens. The birds are so crowded inside the cages that they cannot even stretch their wings. And also because they're crowded, the weaker birds cannot get away from the stronger birds. And the stronger birds may peck at the weaker birds, may attack them. And in some cases, even when they do peck them and they draw blood, cannibalism will occur. The stronger birds will attack and kill the weaker bird and eat its flesh. If you can look closely, I don't know if the photo shows you sharply enough, but if you look at this bird here, her head is protruding out of the wire, you will see that she has a very short beak. And the reason she has a very short beak is because the pointy tip of the beak has been cut off. That is a very painful procedure in itself. The beak of a hen is full of nerves. It's, of course, the way the hen relates to her environment. Out in the open, she would be using her beak in a natural condition to find food, and it has nerves to detect whether what she has found is something that she can eat or perhaps a small pebble that she can't eat. So it's a very painful procedure to cut through the nerves of the beak, but it is routinely done on hens kept in this way in order to prevent them, as I said, pecking each other to death. So this also is, although it's banned in some countries, it is again standard in China. Once again, you see very large Chinese egg-producing factory, and the cages are all very crowded with hens. Some of them at the top, you can see, are trying to stick their heads through the wire, but what you are seeing is a place where there are tens of thousands of birds confined for their entire laying life. They're in these cages usually for a year, sometimes even a little bit longer, before their rate of laying eggs starts to decline. And once it declines, they will be taken out and slaughtered, and they will be replaced with new hens. And I want to come back to this photo of chicken meat production. Again, let me say, this is the way in which almost all the chickens produced for meat are reared. It's true you can find some that are not, and again, there may be some roaming around a village in a rural area, but I can tell you that in the United States, 99.8% of chickens are produced indoors like this. In other words, only 2 in every 1,000 chickens sold in the United States are not inside a shed like this. And I would assume that the figure is not very different here in Taiwan or in China or in most other industrialized countries. Now, I have this quotation here, perhaps you can read, from Professor John Webster, who is a veterinarian, a scientist, who has spent his life studying the welfare of farmed animals. And he founded a major centre at the University of Bristol in England for understanding the welfare of farmed animals. So why does he say that this is, of all the things that I've shown you, the most severe systematic example of man's inhumanity to another sentient animal? Well, one thing that you can see, obviously, is how crowded these birds are. You can't really see the floor, they're just filling the whole space. But there are other things that you can't see that concern Professor Webster. One of them is the selective breeding that has led to the chickens raised today that you see in this picture. So they have been bred to be very, very hungry and to eat a great deal, which leads them to put on weight very fast. So the chickens that you buy in a supermarket, if you buy chickens, are only 6 or 7 weeks old. They're really very young birds. Chickens live normally at least 7 years, sometimes longer. So they're very young birds, and they're much younger than the chickens who were being raised for meat even 50 years ago when animal liberation first appeared, because of this selective breeding. Now, there are a couple of important facts that result from this selective breeding and this very rapid weight gain. One is the birds have immature bones. Their bones have not had time to really mature and strengthen in the short time that they are raised. And yet they are very large birds. They are as large, they weigh as much as a bird twice or 3 times as old would have weighed in earlier times. And because of that, their legs struggle to support their weight. So Professor Webster has established that they are in pain for the last perhaps 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks at least, of their lives, because their legs don't really support them. He's compared it to somebody with arthritis in their legs being forced to stand up all day. And another consequence of this is that sometimes the bird's legs will collapse under them. They just break because of the weight of their body. Now that means the bird can no longer move. And if the bird, let's say one of these birds here, if that happened, they could not walk to where the food and water is. The food and water comes down these pipes through the shed. Would somebody notice that they could not walk? No. It doesn't pay to employ the labour to check all of these birds. So they will simply starve to death or die of dehydration. And this is accepted in the industry. If you look at the agricultural journals, you will see that it is accepted that about 5% of the birds will die before they're ready for market, even though they're very young birds. And that's just a cost. If you could, of course, avoid it by having birds who grew more slowly, but if you did, you would make less profit, even though maybe you would get a higher percentage of the birds surviving to market, but on the whole, because they took longer, you would make less profit. So that's another factor that is relevant here. I'll mention one more thing that you cannot see. As I said, these birds are bred to be very hungry and to put on weight very fast. They, however, are killed at an early age before they are sexually mature. So 95% of them anyway survive. But in order to have these birds, of course, you have to have parents. They have to have sexually mature parents who can breed. If you allowed the sexually mature parents to eat as much as they wished, only a very small percentage of them would survive, actually would live long enough to become sexually mature and to continue to breed and produce eggs that would hatch into chickens. So what do the producers do? Essentially, they keep the birds, the breeding birds I'm talking about now, they keep them on a semi-starvation diet. And literally, one standard practice is to feed them only every second day. So you have these birds who are bred to be very hungry and to put on weight fast, starved every second day. And it's obvious that they are searching for food, they are hungry, they drink a lot of water, but that doesn't satisfy their hunger. So it's another cost to the industry of this selective breeding, but because it pays, it is standard in the industry. So that, I think, is why this is perhaps the worst of the forms of factory farming that we have, although the others are also very bad. Just briefly, I want to mention that milk production has become more intensive as well. It used to be that the cows were outside in the fields. That may still exist on a small scale, but the big dairies now bring their cows indoors and do not allow them to roam around on grass. They feed them hay while they're producing milk. And the other thing I want to mention about the dairy industry is that cows, of course, like humans, do not produce milk unless they have recently given birth. So part of the dairy industry is separation of the calf from the mother at a very early age, within hours of birth. And cows, of course, are mammals. As you see here, the cows care for their calves. They suffer when the calves are removed. They call out for the calf for days afterwards, some cases even weeks afterwards. Of course, the calf, particularly the male calf, is either killed immediately or sold for veal, as I showed you. The female calf is likely to be raised as a dairy cow herself. And finally, I want to mention industrial fish production, which, as I said, is huge. Of those roughly 200 billion animals, vertebrate animals raised for food, something like 120 billion of them are fish. And a lot of that huge, high-scale production of fish for food, again, occurs in East Asia. It occurs in China, in Korea, and other Asian countries. So it's, again, a serious welfare problem which has been very much neglected. Okay, one area where we have made some progress that I want to talk about is understanding the sentience of non-human animals. The picture that you're seeing here is one of my favorites because this is an Australian bird. It's a sulphur-crested cockatoo. And sometime in the last few years, we have, the Australian local governments have introduced these large trash cans in which households put out their trash. The cockatoos are wild birds, but they have adapted quite well to living in the suburbs. The cockatoos have learnt that the bins with red lids contain food. The bins with yellow lids contain recycling plastics, so they're not interested in the bins with yellow lids. And they've also learnt to open these quite heavy lids, which is a bit of a skill. The bird has to stand on the edge of the bin, get their beaks under it, and then walk towards the side of the bin when the hinge is. And if they keep walking, the lid will fall down over the other side, and they can get into the bin and get some food. And scientists have documented the interesting phenomenon that this is clearly learned behavior, because it begins in one particular place. You know, residents will start reporting to the council, hey, the cockatoos are getting at my rubbish and making a mess. And you can locate where this begins in any city, for instance, and then it spreads in concentric circles, wider and wider circles. It spreads in the area as the birds copy each other and find that they can get food that way. So, as I say, birds are more intelligent than we often give them credit for. I want to mention fish in particular because, as I just said, the largest number of factory farmed animals are fish. In 1975, there were quite a few people who said, oh, we shouldn't worry about fish, they can't feel pain, they're different from us. But there has now been good research done on the sentience of fish and their capacity to suffer. This is a book called Do Fish Feel Pain by a scientist who sadly died just a few years ago called Victoria Braithwaite. And this is Lynn Snedden, a scientist who's also worked with fish. And she states clearly here that the science has shown without doubt that fish are capable of suffering. And I think that is certainly true, that there has been good scientific work showing this capacity to suffer in many different ways. And if you're skeptical or you meet somebody who is skeptical, I suggest you refer them to the research, either the book by Victoria Braithwaite or there are several articles published in leading scientific journals by Lynn Snedden. But we can even go beyond fish and beyond vertebrates. I have talked about the number of vertebrate animals raised for food, but we are now starting to learn more about invertebrates, and we certainly cannot assume that it is only vertebrate animals who are sentient beings. What you're seeing here on this side of the screen is the cover of a report, a review of the sentience in cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans. Cephalopod mollusk you see here, the octopus, and perhaps many of you have already known about the sentience and the intelligence of octopus. There was a popular film called My Octopus Teacher, in which many people saw this. Octopus are very clever at solving puzzles of various kinds, and they have quite large brains. I think there's no question that they are conscious. And the decapod crustaceans are also, they include lobsters and crabs, and there's also good evidence that they feel pain. And in many countries, when lobsters and crabs are killed for food, they are dropped into boiling water, and I think there's no doubt that this causes them pain. It is not an instant death at all, and it causes them pain. And what I particularly want to point out about this report that I showed you the cover of in the last slide is that it is a fine example of how science and philosophy can come together, because it was produced by a team that combined scientists and philosophers at the London School of Economics, part of the University of London system, led by Professor Jonathan Birch, who is a philosopher. And interestingly, it had an almost immediate impact on legislation in the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom was just passing a law recognizing animals as sentient beings. The European Union has had such a law, or in fact it's part of the basic treaty of the European Union, and so when the United Kingdom was part of the European Union, animals had that legal status of sentient beings. So they were not things and they were not human persons, they had a kind of intermediate legal status. But when the United Kingdom left the European Union, that no longer applied. So the animal welfare movement said, we should again have a law saying animals have the status of sentient beings. And the government agreed with that and brought in a law. And when the law went to the House of Lords, the second chamber of the UK Parliament, the question was raised, well, what animals are we talking about? And previously in law, it had only been vertebrate animals who were recognized as sentient. But this report persuaded the House of Lords to amend the legislation to include cephalopods and decapod crustaceans, and the House of Commons accepted that amendment, and that is now the law in the United Kingdom. So I think we need to be more open-minded about some of the invertebrate animals as well, and where we can, we should give them the benefit of doubt and assume that because they may be sentient, we should not do things that will cause them to suffer. Now let me move on to a completely new challenge, just briefly, and that is the challenge of AI. There's a lot of discussion about AI, of course, and that includes discussion about the ethics of AI. We have seen that. We have seen that there was a lot of discussion, for example, about whether AI is biased against some groups of society, whether decisions it makes might be reflecting the biases of the information that the AI was programmed about. So, for example, in many countries there's been concern that AI may have a racist bias or a sexist bias. But what about the possibility that AI also has a speciesist bias? That field had been greatly neglected. I wrote an article together with Yip Phai Tsai, a Hong Kong-based researcher who had contacted me about the problem. And we wrote an article for this journal, AI and Ethics. And in our research for the article, we examined publicly made statements, whether by governments or by scientific bodies, about AI and ethics. And we found 72 statements like that. But at the time we wrote the article, none of them actually mentioned animals. They were all about AI and ethics for humans. Since then, there have been just 2 statements now that have mentioned animals, one issued by the government of Serbia and another issued by a conference in Montreal. But still, it's very much a neglected area. Now you might ask, well, what does AI have to do with animals? And the answer is, AI has quite a lot to do with animals in various ways. One obvious one is AI is programmed to run autonomous vehicles or self-driving cars. We may not have many fully autonomous vehicles on the road yet, but that's probably going to happen. So a question is, if the sensors on the AI detect a human being on the road, they are all programmed so that the car will stop or swerve and not hit the human being. But what if what they are detecting is a dog or a cat or a deer, or for Australians perhaps kangaroos? It happens that they get hit by cars. Or what about a smaller animal but not a domestic companion animal like a squirrel? So I think AI should take into account the interests of animals, including animals who are not companion animals. So that's one problem. Bigger problem is that AI is already being used in factory farms. What you see here is an AI-controlled robot in a chicken farm, but AI may have the potential to make factory farms cheaper to run and harder for alternatives to compete with, and it may enable producers to crowd animals even more if that's possible. If the AI can allow maximizing productivity. If it's programmed only to maximize productivity and profitability, then it may introduce even worse conditions than we have today. I'll also mention that if you want to look at the bias of AI, it's not difficult to do, because if you just ask AI a simple question like, what can I do with a dog? The AI will give you information about how you can look after the dog, how you can play with the dog and take care of the dog properly. if you ask an AI, what can I do with a chicken, the AI will give you recipes for cooking and eating the chicken, not for enhancing the well-being of the chicken. So that's another way in which we can try to encourage the people developing AI to think about animal welfare. All right, another interesting new challenge, which has some hopeful aspects, is the development of cultured meat. Cultured meat is meat created from the cells of animals. So no animal, no sentient being is actually created for that meat or killed for that meat. It is meat at the cellular level, but it is something that has been developed and grown, and it exists already, but on a small scale and at high cost. I have actually eaten cellular chicken in Singapore because Singapore was, I think, the first country to license the sale of cellular meat. I ate it in a restaurant. It was not available in supermarkets because the price they would have had to charge would have prevented anybody buying it. But I have to say I didn't find it particularly tasty, but I haven't eaten chicken for 50 years, so obviously I'm not an expert on whether it really tasted like chicken or not. But the challenge is to produce it in a way that meat eaters will consume. I'm not particularly interested in consuming cultured meat, but I would like people whose habit is to eat meat and who have so far not changed because of the ethical arguments, whether arguments about animal welfare or arguments about the environment and other impacts. I would like them to shift to cultured meat to reduce the suffering of animals in factory farms. That seems to me to be a promising alternative, but the challenges are firstly to reduce the price so it's economically competitive with meat from animals, and secondly to make it so tasty that meat eaters want to actually make this change. And if that could happen, it would be good for animals and also good for the environment. So I'm nearly finished now. Let me just come to my final slide, what I see as the challenge that is the most important challenge we face because of the huge number of animals who, as I've said, are suffering because of intensive animal production. It involves this enormous, you can barely think about, how can we imagine even 200 billion animals in factory farms? We can imagine the suffering of individuals, but to extrapolate that 200 billion times is probably beyond the capacities of human imagination. But it is a vast amount of suffering that is being inflicted on animals right now while we're talking. It also, some people will say we need to do this in order to produce enough food for the world. But that's a myth. Factory farming reduces the amount of food available for human beings. Because when we confine animals indoors, obviously we have to grow food and bring it to them. When animals are out grazing in the fields or on the plains, they eat grass. Cows anyway eat grass and things that we cannot eat and digest. So that does add to the availability of food for humans. But if we have to grow food for animals, we feed it to them, they use that food, or they use the part of the nutritional value of the food simply to keep their bodies warm and to live and breathe. We're talking about mammals and birds. They're warm-bodied animals mostly, not so much the fish, but they, in all cases, we get back only a small fraction of the food value of what we give to them. And there's now an enormous amount of grain that is being fed to animals and a huge amount of soybeans. In fact, the majority of the world's soybean crop is now fed to animals. It's not used for human consumption in the form of tofu or soy milk. The majority goes to animals, where again we waste most of the food value of that very nutritious bean. So we would be better able to feed the world's population without factory farming. We also are increasing greenhouse gas emissions. Animals emit greenhouse gases, particularly the ruminant animals, so cows, including dairy cows and beef cows, and sheep in particular, emit large amounts of greenhouse gases. And we can reduce that. The cultured meat production will reduce greenhouse gases, if it spreads, by something like 90%. Also, there is a public health risk, actually two public health risks. What I have on the slide is the risk of another pandemic, because it's clear that viruses can spread in the factory farm conditions, and we need to try to reduce that risk. If we go back to the pandemic before we had COVID-19, that was a swine flu pandemic, and it came out of factory farm pigs. So we could easily get another pandemic out of factory farms. It could be as contagious as COVID, or even more so, but much more deadly. So there is a serious health risk from pandemics, from factory farms. And I'll also mention that many factory farms routinely feed antibiotics to animals. It seems to improve productivity, but this means we have lost the usefulness of some antibiotics, because the routine feeding of antibiotics to animals means that the bacteria, some strains of bacteria will develop that are multiply resistant to antibiotics, and hospitals have to deal with that problem all the time now. So, in my view, the animal movement's primary goal should be to focus on factory farming and to seek to reduce factory farming. I'm happy to leave you with that message. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Snger. Ladies and gentlemen, as we conclude today's panel, let me thank Professor Peter Snger, Venerable Master Zhao Wei, our speaker, and all of us being part of this meaningful event. Professor Snger has reminded us that of the enduring problems of animal suffering, while also pointing to new challenges of our time, including how technologies like AI intersect with animal welfare. His message is clear. These issues are not only matters of theory, but urgent call for action. Well, as you can see from my tie pin, I came back from Texas, because this is the tie pin with Longhorn. I talked to some of the farmers, actually, or dairy farmer there, and tried to have a very vivid conversation over cultured meat and other possibilities, such as clean water and taking insect as alternative food in order to solve hunger problem worldwide. Now, it seems that it suggests that today's launch of Animal Liberation Now shows us that philosophy, religions, and activism can work together to guide how we live, how we consume, and how we care for all being on this planet. Now, let's take this spirit of today's forest by reflecting and by engaging and by acting with wisdom and compassion. Of course, in good spirit of Professor Snger has suggested and remind us so much. Thank you, and we look forward to continuing this important journey together, and let's conclude this panel with a big applause to our speaker, Peter Snger.
我们感谢吴友能教授担任本场次的主持人，更感谢 Professor Peter Snger 跟我们分享西方世界对友情的判准以及 AI 与伦理在动物面向的挑战。 那我们这一场就到这里结束。
Thank you, Professor Wu, and special appreciation for Professor Snger for your enlightening speech.